Good afternoon. My name is Tony Mazzacci, Chief Advocacy Officer of the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. Thank you for joining us for today's ASPPH Presents webinar, Managing Compliance Challenges Involving Global Collaborators. This webinar is part of the 2019 ASPPH Presents series, which has been designed as a service to CEF-accredited ASPPH member schools and programs of public health. But we welcome all attendees today, whether you're at one of our institutions or not. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the ASPPH website in the archived webinar sections shortly. All registrants will receive an email with a link to the posted recording and the slides when they're available. Additionally, this webinar has been approved for 1 hour of CPH continuing education credit. A few housekeeping items of note. A PDF of today's slides are available for immediate download in the handout section, or will be sometime during the presentation. And while you're in listen-only mode and your lines have been muted, we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentations by using the chat or question box on the right side of your screen. There we are. So you can feel free to enter the questions at any time during the webinar. I'm pleased now to turn the program over to our moderator, Dr. Penny Gordon-Larson. She's Professor of Nutrition and the Associate Dean for Research at the University of North Carolina Gillings School of Global Public Health. She's also co-chair-elect of the ASPPH Research Section. Dr. Gordon-Larson.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you to all the attendees for joining us for today's webinar. And we have a great number of participants and really indicates a strong indication of interest in the topic. So for some time now, there's been concern about organized and sophisticated efforts by foreign nations, both allies and perceived rivals, to acquire intellectual property that is generated by US companies and laboratories. Some of these efforts have included unauthorized and illegal activities. And at the same time, we value international collaboration, so we need to understand how to navigate collaborative global research responsibly and ethically. For many in academia, including within academic public health, we recognize this as an issue of rightful concern in computer science and engineering schools, but not in our world. So as a result, many of our faculty and staff were initially skeptical of the seriousness of the problem, thinking that it was part of the xenophobic agenda of some politicians and their ideological supporters. So many of us were really shocked to learn from the NIH leadership that they've documented more than 100 instances of troubling foreign influence on NIH-funded extramural research, including withholding information about funding sources, undeclared and unmanaged conflicts of interest, and gross violations of the peer review system, including major breaches of grant application confidentiality. A recent NIH publication reported that NIH has investigated at least 180 scientists at more than 65 institutions for violating policies that require grantees to report their foreign ties. And the agency has referred 21 cases to the HHS Officer of the Inspector General for debarment to prevent scientists from applying for grants. So the majority of these cases involve Chinese researchers conducting preclinical research, and importantly, nearly every scientist involved has been well-funded and established. So these are not postdoctoral fellows or students. And what's equally really important to recognize, though, is, as Dr. Mike Lauer, NIH Deputy Director for Extramural Research, who is joining us today, recently said at a bioethics seminar on NIH campus, and I quote, "This is not xenophobic racism, it's not targeting, and this is not stigma, this is real theft." For the leaders of public health schools and programs, the NIH's findings and the renewed emphasis on managing, monitoring, and reporting engagements with foreign collaborators is a major new compliance challenge. At our schools and programs, we often have collaborations with foreign partners that are managed from the top down, but we have many more collaborations that were initiated from the bottom up, that were driven by research needs and the need to engage with communities. So we're fortunate to have with us today here 3 individuals with varying perspectives on these compliance challenges, which in some cases are long-standing requirements on which there is new emphasis. So let me introduce all 3 of our speakers. We'll hold all questions until after all 3 sets of comments, but you can submit any questions at any time. Our first presenter is Dr. Michael Lauer, the Deputy Director for Extramural Research at the NIH, where he serves as the Principal Scientific Leader and Advisor to the Director of the NIH on all matters relating to substance quality and effectiveness of the NIH Extramural Research Program and Administration. He received education and training at Rensselaer Polytechnic, at Albany Medical College, Harvard Medical School, and the Harvard School of Public Health. He spent 14 years at Cleveland Clinic as a professor of medicine, epidemiology, and biostatistics. And from 2007 to 2015, he served as division director for the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, where he championed efforts to leverage big data infrastructure to enable high efficiency population clinical research. After Dr. Lauer, we'll hear from Toby Smith, who is the Vice President for Policy at the Association of American Universities. AAU is the voice of 62 research-intensive universities in Washington. Mr. Smith has been very engaged in these issues across all federal agencies and with the White House, and he will give us the broader perspective, including how this issue is playing in Congress, whether we're likely to see new government-wide regulatory and legislative requirements. Prior to joining AAU in January 2003, Toby worked as a federal relations representative in the Washington offices of the University of Michigan and the MIT. He began his Washington career on Capitol Hill as a legislative assistant to Congressman Bob Traxler. Our third speaker is Valerie Bonham, and she is the Healthcare and Life Sciences Counsel for the national law firm Ropes & Gray. Ms. Bonham is the past executive director of the President's Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. She has also had nearly 20 years of experience as a senior advisor in the Office of the Director of the National Institutes of Health and as senior attorney in the Office of General Counsel of the HHS. She now provides legal advice to many universities on various compliance issues. She received her JD from the University of Virginia School of Law, and she also undertook epidemiology and biostatistics training at Hopkins School of Public Health. So we're particularly fortunate and interested in hearing from Ms. Bonham and Mr. Smith about the advice they are providing faculty regarding compliance and reporting challenges on these issues. And I apologize in advance for any interruptions from our side to keep us on track to finish at 3 p.m. So I'll start with Mike Lauer. Dr. Lauer, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great. Thank you, Penny. And I want to thank you all I want to thank ASPPH for inviting me to be part of this webinar and congratulate you for putting on a terrific program. Okay. So I want to start with an article that appeared in Nature in January of 2018. It was entitled, "What is China's 1,000 Talents Plan? The nation's bid to lure back expat scientists and recruit highly skilled foreign researchers is now in its 10th year." This article was highly complimentary, and it suggested that this may be a way for outstanding scientists to obtain funding. In the article, it did describe, however, that this is not an ordinary kind of research funding program. This is taken straight from the article in Nature. It points out that in order to apply for a Talents Award, you already have to have a firm job offer from a Chinese institution. In other words, you have to change your employment status such that you are formally employed either part-time or full-time by a Chinese university. The scheme is open to Chinese scientists under 55 years of age and foreigners younger than 65. So foreigners in this case would be scientists who are based here in the United States. All applicants must have worked at renowned universities outside China. So they are targeting people who work in outstanding universities here in the United States. Many of them are expats who previously lived in China. And the applications to the 1,000 Talents program goes through the Chinese university employer. Now, why is this a problem? The reason why this is a problem is that in most cases, and in fact, we've seen that this is true in nearly all cases, people who win these awards do not disclose that fact to their American employer or to the NIH, and that runs contrary to NIH requirements, and it runs contrary to requirements of many employers as well. This is pointed out in a report that was put out by the Hoover Institution from Stanford University. The report was first published late last year. There was an updated version published this year. It says China's most systematic channel for identifying foreign-based non-traditional collectors is its Thousand Talents program. In a few minutes, I'll talk about that term, non-traditional collector, and what exactly that means. It aims to recruit leading overseas scientists. Official Chinese Thousand Talents program websites list more than 300 U.S. government researchers and more than 600 U.S. corporate personnel who have accepted Thousand Talents program money. In many cases, these individuals do not disclose receiving the Thousand Talents program money to their employer, which for U.S. government employees is illegal, and for corporate personnel likely represent a conflict of interest that violates their employment agreement or employee agreement. We've seen this too. Most of the people that we deal with are employed by universities or academic health centers or medical schools. And in fact, we've also seen that they most of the time do not disclose their Thousand Talents program money or their Thousand Talents program employment. Now, the employment is a critical issue here. People who receive a Thousand Talents program award sign an employment contract. This is not getting a grant, which is based in your university here in the United States. You're actually formally employed by a university in China. We've had an opportunity now to see dozens of these employment contracts, and they suggest that a number of things are going on. Now, the first is that we see these so-called shadow laboratories. I'm going to show this schematically in a few minutes, but the idea is that the American scientist who receives a Talents Award is employed by a Chinese university and is setting up a laboratory in their Chinese university that looks very much like the laboratory that they have in the United States. The employment agreements include a time commitment. Sometimes it's 2 months a year, 3 months a year, but sometimes it's much more substantial than that. It may be 6 months a year. We've actually seen some contracts where they sign on for full time, 9 months to 12 months of the year. And again, they're doing this without their American employer knowing anything about this. Their American employer thinks that they're employed for 12 months of the year here in the United States. The contracts often include substantial funding for research. We have seen some that are in the millions of dollars. We've seen many that are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. They include provision of a laboratory, of equipment, of personnel to staff the laboratory. There may be a signing bonus. There's a salary. There's a housing benefit. A typical housing benefit is about $70,000 to $75,000 one time. And there may be other benefits as well, such as support for a spouse trying to find a job. Now, in return for this, the American scientists are expected to provide deliverables. This includes training people. It includes writing papers, and sometimes this can be quite explicit. We've seen contracts that say that they have to write 12 papers over a period of 5 years, that they have to write papers that all appear in journals that have an impact factor of greater than 10. We've seen a contract in which the scientist agreed to publish a paper in Science, Nature, or Cell. Some contracts stipulate that they must also produce domestic patents, by domestic meaning China, as well as provide IP to their Chinese institution. These kinds of employment contracts obviously create conflicts of commitment and conflict of interest. This would be particularly obvious if they sign a full-time employment contract in China while at the same time holding a full-time job here in the United States. And we have actually seen that. So the expected effort would be greater than 100%. Now, when you think about this, we have to go back to an obvious question, which is what is a recruitment? The Thousand Talents program is a recruitment program. They're quite clear about that. So I'm going to start by thinking about this by going over what a recruitment is. Now, this may be a simple model of the world. On the left here is an American university. It has one academic leader who might be a dean or a department chair, and there's one scientist. And then you have a Chinese university who has one academic leader and one scientist. Now, let's say that this Chinese academic leader would like to recruit this American scientist. So they offer a recruitment package. It's really good. And then as a result, the Chinese university gets one new researcher and the American university loses one. This is all perfectly appropriate, perfectly proper. This is the way the world works. Now, of course, at this time, the American University understands that it no longer has this researcher. They're no longer paying him. They no longer consider this person to be a member of their faculty. Now, the Talents program works quite differently. This is the symbol for the Talents program here. Here, what happens is that the scientist is brought into the Chinese university, but at the same time, they maintain their position in the American university. And in fact, the American academic leader may, in fact, usually doesn't have any idea about what's going on. And so the result is that the Chinese university has a window into what's going on in the American lab. They set up the essentially the equivalent laboratory in China, and what better way of doing that than bringing in the expertise of the person who runs the laboratory, namely the PI, him or herself. So this is a very different kind of a recruitment, and this has been referred to as a non-traditional collection. Remember, I used that term before. You know, if we think about a typical type of collector or spy, that might be someone like James Bond. Here in this case, this person is a scientist. He looks like a scientist and works like a scientist. But in this way, the Chinese institution is able to collect information from this American laboratory in a non-traditional way by having their scientist who's working in the American laboratory also work in a Chinese laboratory at essentially the same time. How do we discover that there may be problems? Well, one way we discover this, and one way that a number of universities have figured this out on their own, is by looking at the acknowledgement section of papers. So you'll see in an acknowledgement section something like, this work was supported by a certain provincial talents program to a particular scientist, or this work was supported by the National Natural Science Foundation of China, and there are certain grants that are linked with it, along with NIH grants. Once you have an employment position in China, you not only have that support, but you also have the ability to apply for grants from Chinese granting agencies that then go through your Chinese employer, not through your American employer. Or supported by the National Basic Research Program of China, which is called the 973 program. Now, in each of these cases, what would happen is you would see that your faculty member has support from a Chinese grant or from a Chinese talents program, but if you look within your own files, you won't see it. And if you look, and when we look within our NIH files, we see no mention of any of this support from the talents program or from these Chinese granting agencies. Now, an extreme version of this is illustrated here. You can imagine a scientist who has a grant from an American funding agency like the NIH. The grant may have three aims, A, B, and C. And then when we take the opportunity to look at the Chinese grant is absolutely identical. So we've actually seen cases of this where the United States NIH is funding a grant that the China National Science Foundation is funding as well. It's funding the exact same identical grant. And in cases like this, universities have refunded us because we're now engaged in duplicative funding. And obviously this is a real problem because investigators are double dipping. They're getting funded twice for the same work. We've seen cases of this. More often what we see are grants that are similar. They're in similar areas of science, although they may not be absolutely identical. Nonetheless, the scientist is getting substantial support from a Chinese employer or from a Chinese granting agency without any of that information being known to their American employer or to the NIH, and this can then lead to distorted and ill-informed funding decisions. In a way, if we think about this, this is a kind of theft. And here's an example that's quite explicit. This was described in the Cancer Letter last April. A researcher who was based at MD Anderson who engaged in quid pro quo exchanges of personal and professional benefits in pursuit of a foreign talents program membership. So what this person did was he took material that belonged to the University of Texas system. This included primers, data, documents, none of which belonged to him. It belonged to the University of Texas. He then put these materials in a suitcase, flew off to China, and delivered this to people in China with the understanding that in exchange for that, he would receive Talents Employment and Talents Award. Of course, he did this without the knowledge of the University of Texas and without going through appropriate channels such as a executing material transfer agreement. All right, so we've talked about undisclosed employment, shadow laboratories, undisclosed grants, and in some cases, outright theft from universities in order to secure a foreign talents award for personal benefit. That's one major kind of problem. A second major kind of problem is something which may be a little bit more familiar to us, and that's failure to disclose conflict of interest. This comes from a story about Kang Zhang. Kang Zhang was an ophthalmologist, a geneticist at the University of California at San Diego. He had a company which was called the Guangzhou Kangrui Biological Pharmaceutical Technology Company. So just keep in mind now, this scientist is based in San Diego. He had this company which was based in China. It was named after him and his wife. Kang was his first name and Rui was his wife's first name. Together, this company was worth $11.7 million. Together, the two of them had approximately 75% ownership. He had 49% ownership. She had 26 or 27% ownership. So between the two of them, they had majority interest in this company. Now, here's an example of a paper that they published in Nature. There are many authors here. She's one of the co-authors. She identifies one affiliation, this is affiliation number 7, which is the Guangzhou Kangrui Biological Pharmaceutical Technology Company. Kang Zhang, is the senior author. He identifies a number of affiliations, of which his primary affiliation was Sichuan University in China. He also identified the University of California at San Diego. Interestingly enough, he does not identify the company as being one of his affiliations, despite the fact that he had 49% equity interest in the company. And then in the author information section, it says here, the authors declare no competing financial interests. There were 12 such papers in which these two were co-authors. At the same time, they had at least $11 million of financial interest in this company that together they owned in China, and they did not disclose this financial conflict of interest. They didn't disclose it to their local American university, and they didn't disclose it to the NIH. This story is public. It was posted in KPBS last July. Dr. Zhang resigned on July the 3rd. A third kind of problem are peer review breaches. So we've talked about shadow laboratories, undisclosed employment or stealth employment, undisclosed grants, outright theft in order to secure talents employment, talents awards. That was the first major kind of problem. The second kind of problem we talked about was undisclosed conflict of interest. The third major kind of problem was our peer review breaches. This also comes from the Cancer Letter last April regarding a different case at MD Anderson. What this person did was he emailed an NIH grant application to a scientist based in the People's Republic of China. He accessed this application because he was a peer reviewer. He had legitimate access to somebody else's application, which he then downloaded onto his computer, which he is allowed to do. He then attached this to an email and sent it off to a scientist in China. He did this more than once. In one case, he instructed the recipient of the information to keep it to yourself. In another instance, he said, here is bone and meat of what you need. And on a third instance, he sent an application, an NIH grant application, to a department within the National Cancer Center, Cancer Hospital, Chinese Academy of Medical Science. And the transmittal email read, some methods you may learn from this proposal, keep this confidential. So those are the three major kinds of problems that we have observed: the stealth laboratories, undisclosed support, undisclosed grant support. That's the first major kind of problem. The second major kind of problem is failure to disclose significant financial conflicts of interest from Chinese companies. And then the third are peer review breaches. We've been very pleased to see that institutions are increasingly aware of the problem. And then organizations like AAU APLU, AAMC, and others have also, COGR, have also taken a proactive stance. Here's a nice example from a website that was posted by Penn State. Now, I think one thing that's in this website is it points out the balance between the importance of international research and collaborative research on the one hand, and appropriate transparency on the other. And that's shown here. This is language which is taken straight from the website. While most international collaborations are acceptable and encouraged, we urge researchers to err on the side of transparency. It protects everyone's interest, the federal government, Penn State, individual researchers, and their international collaborators, to have international relationships disclosed and vetted to determine if there are any potential conflicts of commitment, duplications of research, and/or diversion of intellectual property in the performance of federally funded research. The key point is that this needs to be done transparently, that American institutions need to know about it, that they need to vet it, and the purpose is to prevent these kinds of problems. And these problems are not theoretical. We've seen all of these. We've seen conflicts of commitment. We've seen duplicative research. We've seen diversion of intellectual property, all within the context of the performance of federally funded research. We've taken a number of actions. We've worked closely with institutions. We've now reached out to 70 institutions about specific cases. Institutions have taken a number of actions to deal with problems. In some cases, they have refunded the government for overcharges or duplicative grants. We have, as Penny alluded to, referred cases to OIG and FBI for consideration of debarment, suspension, or other possible actions. We're working closely with other federal agencies, including NSF, DOE, DOD. And what we're looking for is full disclosure and vetting. This is a critical part of proper oversight and stewardship over faculty activities, which we see as being a critical part of the government-university partnership. I'm just going to end by saying that this is a team sport. We have many people at NIH who are working on this. We're working closely with the FBI, with the Department of Justice, with the Director of National Intelligence. We're working closely with a number of non-federal organizations, including COGR, AAU, APLU, AAMC, the National Academy of Sciences, FDP, and others. Within the Department of Health and Human Services, we're working with our Office of Inspector General and the Office of National Security. There's a very active effort going on at the Department of State. My colleague, Dr. Jody Black, is helping lead that from the NIH side. We have engaged in outreach with many countries around the world and are continuing to do that. These countries are seeing similar problems as we are. There's an active effort at OSTP, which is ongoing, and this involves people from many federal agencies. We're working quite closely with NSF, DOE, DOD, and others, as I mentioned. And then finally, we've worked with dozens of vice presidents for research and institutional compliance and integrity leaders who have helped us to better understand the nature of the threat, the nature of the problem, and steps that we can all take to address this threat so that we can move forward and do great work without having to worry about our creativity and our resources being stolen by others. So I hope you found this helpful, and I'll turn this back to ASPPH and look forward to the rest of the program.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lauer, for that really informative presentation. We'll now hear from Toby Smith of the AAU.
Thanks, Penny. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. And what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is just give some context in terms of what are we seeing from Congress, what are we seeing from the federal agencies, and then how our universities, certainly the associations like AAU, have been working to respond, taking this very seriously. And I'll talk a little bit about that. In thinking about what to title this, I thought about calling it a view from the trenches, because my life changed going back about a year and a half ago in terms of where I was spending a bulk of my time working for AAU. And that really started in the inflection point that I recognize and point towards was when Chris Wray testified with a number of others, Chris Wray being the director of the FBI, and was asked by Senator Marco Rubio about issues relating to universities and potential threats from students and scholars, to which he said that, in fact, as Mike has already mentioned, there was a big problem with China using non-traditional collectors of information in the form of students and scholars, and that universities were largely naive to this problem. So from there, what has happened is that was not the only time that Chris Wray went up to Capitol Hill and warned them of these threats, but other intelligence agencies have been up sounding the alarm. There have been numerous reports that have been written since then. The Hoover Institution report that Mike referred to, others by the Hudson Institute, the Wilson Institute. There is a book called Spy Schools by Daniel Golden, which was released not long ago, and that also talks about these issues. So that's caused the agencies to react with various letters. They've been trying to clarify both old policies and developing new policies. And we've also seen a lot of activity from Congress. One of the problems, though, is when Congress gets involved, they lack an understanding about our universities, how research is done, and they also lack what we already do to control some of these issues and how many different regulatory policies we already in place. That's led to some really ill-informed and potentially damaging proposals. I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of what Congress has been up to. But what are the concerns? You've heard many of these from Mike already. I want to stress one concern we didn't talk about, which is institutional relationships. And many of our institutions have had relationships with Chinese companies or received funding for research. Huawei has been the one that's been often in the news, and many of our universities have, since this is broken and Huawei is now on the Commerce Control Entities list, they are not accepting any funds going forward from Huawei. I won't spend a lot of time on these other things, the next couple of ones, because Mike covered them well. Talent recruitment programs, faculty relationships that they are not disclosing with foreign funding sources or entities, the shadow laboratories issue that Mike raised, and breaches in peer review. I do raise one thing because there is a concern that people are being profiled or may be being profiled. I don't think that's the case. It is really about behaviors that are wrong. And so even with some of the breaches, and I think I've heard Mike say this, the breaches in peer review are not necessarily just, that we've had some instances where proposals might have been shipped to a foreign country. We've also had those issues domestically too, with faculty telling a member, a friend down the hall about a proposal they shouldn't be talking about. There's also concern about foreign investment and what companies are investing in startups here in the U.S. It's something that is worth noting. We've had on our campuses concerns about Confucius Institutes. These are institutes where China actually sends folks over who teach Chinese language. They often send them and they provide money to these institutes. And there's been concern that they might be being used to both peddle soft influence for China, but even some reports that they become a hub for recruiting other people to talent programs and the like. There's concern about Chinese student groups, that they're actually being used by the Chinese government as mechanisms to spy on other students who might say things or do things or take classes even that are opposed to views that the Chinese government holds. The last thing I just want to put on the radar screen is there's growing concern about genetic information from U.S. citizens and where it travels. And this gets to sequencing of DNA and what companies we are using for that information. If you understand, as I have heard, China has a ban on any genetic information on people leaving the country. Yet we are happy to provide that and work with Chinese companies. I warn, I don't have it in legislation. There's been no legislation yet, but we have heard rumbles that this might be another place where there will be legislation coming in the not so distant future. So let me just talk a little bit about what we've seen from the agencies. The National Institutes of Health, of course, you've heard a lot of what they're up to. And after that February statement from Chris Wray, it wasn't long. And then in August, we saw the letter that from Dr. Collins that really caught a lot of our institution's attention, because it wasn't Department of Defense, it wasn't Department of Energy, it was NIH. And then we had the Directors Advisory Council Working Group made recommendations in December. There were reminders about the need to disclose other support that came out from NIH in July. Then many of the letters that went to institutions that Mike referred to, contacting them about some of the cases they had found that they were concerned about, went out. And we've seen several of those. We've seen several hearings. We've seen a focus on this in the Appropriations Committee, and there has certainly been lots of media articles. We're actually tracking the media articles every week for AAU, and there are no less than 10 in any given week that are covering this topic in one way, shape, or form. As it relates to the National Science Foundation, well, they weren't the only ones. There were 3 agencies, I think, that were lucky recipients of letters from Senator Grassley on this issue. NIH got one of those, as well as the Department of Defense, but so did NSF. They also were concerned and have been clarifying current and pending support requirements, as well as there was a major discussion in July of this year, in which I actually participated with the National Science Board. Finally, they've commissioned a study by the Jasons. Jasons are a group of top-notch scientists who for a long time have done technical studies on behalf of relating to national security issues. And they are looking at really, has the environment changed? What is the risk versus benefit of foreign students, foreign talent? And that will be coming out sometime later this fall. It will be mostly unclassified. I think there'll be a classified addendum, so stay tuned for that. Just quickly, some things I know you may not be as interested in DOD or DOE, but it is important to know that they are very much involved in these discussions too. Last year in the National Defense Authorization Act, they were directed in Section 1286 to look at these talent recruitment programs, work with universities proactively. They have established a task force on protecting critical technologies. In March of this year, they issued a memo as well on current pending support requirements. And today, just about 2 hours ago, they sent a letter that will be to the community about this set of issues, stating that the Department of Defense wants to work with the community as it tries to address these threats. Department of Energy, they issued a memo. They've issued back in December of 2018. Then in January, they issued first a memo on assessing and developing a risk matrix of technologies that are involved in DOE and funded by DOE, oftentimes at the labs. January, then they issued another memo which prohibited DOE personnel from participating in foreign talent programs. Then they've also now implemented that prohibition on DOE employees. What has not happened, but is in the works, is they're also coming up with new policies that will affect universities and any research they conduct on part of the Department of Energy. So let's turn to Congress. Well, let's just say it's been pretty busy, and that's why my life changed, in the sense that there have been lots of proposals. I'm not going to go through these in any detail. I will talk about that first one, HR 3038, the Securing American Science and Technology Act, here in a second, as well as, so the other thing I'll just mention is there's been lots of hearings, starting with one that happened back in April of 2018 that was called Scholars or Spies in the House Science Committee. And that was really driven by, again, I think they took note of Chris Wray's comments at that hearing. Just to summarize what's going on, though, in Congress, so you can see, there's been an increased focus on institutional reporting. Institutions are required to report gifts and contract awards of more than $250,000 under the Higher Education Act. The problem is the Department of Education hasn't been all that clear. They never really issued rules on how to do that. There's a dear colleague, but they've now started to launch some investigations on 5 universities for non-compliance with these disclosure requirements. There's restrictions on participation in foreign talent programs. We've seen that in legislation. In fact, there was a proposal that got attached to last year's NDAA. We beat it back, partially because we had the Section 1286 added, that would have prohibited any individual that had participated in a foreign talent program either previously or currently from receiving any Department of Defense funds. There had been creation of new categories of sensitive research areas that would limit access to foreign students or scholars. This is an area we're very concerned about, that this could have dramatic impacts on our ability to use foreign students in some of the research we conduct. There has been this focus on clarifying and enforcing disclosure requirements. There we've seen increased visa delays. Most recently, we've seen some international students actually returning to classes. There were 9 students returned to go back to Arizona State here from China who were turned away at the airport and sent back to China. So we've seen those instances. We've also seen some changes in the visa renewal processes, not so much for the biological areas, but areas like robotics and advanced manufacturing now where you have to renew on a yearly basis, not a 5-year basis, your visas if you're here to study. Last thing is on a positive note, there's been a focus on interagency coordination in some of this legislation, and how do we create forums that promote an ongoing dialogue between the scientific community and the federal agencies and federal government. So on that note, this is where SASTA, or the Securing American Science and Technology Act, comes in. This was legislation that was introduced by Representative Sherrill and Gonzalez. What it would do is require the National Science and Technology Council, overseen by OSTP, to create an interagency working group to work jointly on these issues. It also would call for a national academies roundtable on science, technology, and security that would bring those communities together on a regular basis to talk about these things. The good news is OSTP hasn't waited. Mike referred to the efforts they have underway. They already have, under their joint committee on the research environment, created a subcommittee on research security. It has already met 9 times, has 18 federal agencies involved, and they're focusing a lot right now on the disclosure issues we've already talked about and how to create standards across the agencies so we don't end up with disclosure requirements that are different or markedly different from one agency to the next. So on the coordination front, we're seeing good things out of the federal government. Let me just conclude. So what are universities doing, and how have we been responding at AAU and our other associations? Well, first thing is we have been making it very clear up on the Hill that we take these threats very seriously. And I think as some of these examples have come out that Mike has shared, some of the non-believers on our campuses, or those who viewed this as just a partisan issue or something, have come to see some real examples, and they realize the threat. But at the same time, we fight very hard for the need for openness. It's essential to advance science at the fundamental level. We also know we are heavily dependent, and we benefit greatly from foreign students and scholars. In many of the fields of STEM, it is foreign scholars who are our faculty, and they are the majority, and as well as students. So we recognize that we want to be careful not to do anything that damages our ability to continue to attract and retain the best and brightest students from around the world. So AAU last year, knowing our universities were grappling with this, we worked with our colleagues at the Land Grant Association, APLU. We conducted a survey. We got 140 different examples of effective practices. We essentially asked our institutions, share things that you think are innovative that you're doing in a number of different areas, and we want to then provide those to other institutions to help them as they grapple with this set of issues. Because we were being asked, can you tell us, I was numerously asked, what's the playbook? What do we do to fight back against this? So we did a number of buckets, everything from, communication, how do you communicate, training, enhanced reviews of contracts, grants, cyber and data security. So there are a number of different buckets where we collected that information. The results of that survey are up on our web. site, which we have a whole bunch of resources. If you go to the AAU website under Science and Security Resources, just Google it and you will find it under AAU. But the big thing we kind of said to our institutions is you should be doing three things right now. Start with knowing what your institution already does across the board on this whole range of issues, and make sure that's transparent and clear, because many policymakers don't think we're doing anything on it. Number two, what responsibilities, remind your faculty of what they're supposed to be doing as it relates to disclosure. There are also export control rules. There are rules when you travel abroad in terms of, especially if you're going to embargoed countries, or where any country where we have trade sanctions, or other countries, even China, there are safety things that you might want to do in terms of taking clean laptops or things like that. So remind them of their responsibilities. And finally, once you've done both those first two, figure out what gaps exist and what more you might want to do. At the same time, what we've been stressing is we have to do more in this area. We also have to preserve those fundamental values of openness and the importance of foreign talent. The other thing that's been happening is there have been a number of regional and national meetings. There was a meeting which Mike and I participated in, hosted by Loyola Chicago. It's very useful. There have been actually classified briefings that Senator Warner and Rubio have held for our AAU presidents and ACE. Our colleagues at the American Council of Education have had a presentation, similar presentation. Yet just yesterday, we had a big meeting with the FBI at which Chris Wray came and gave us an update as to whether he thinks we're still as naive as we were a year and a half ago. So with that, I will close and appreciate having, the opportunity to talk about this important set of issues.
Oh, thank you, Toby. And thank you so much for all of your hard work in this critical area. So let's move now to Valerie Bonham from Ropes and Gray.
Terrific, thank you. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. The folks you've already heard from know so very much about this space. And I think that one of the takeaways is that it is changing, it is evolving, and it is the subject of a lot of attention. So with that said, our team has worked with a lot of the entities who, for example, have been receiving inquiries from the NIH. We've worked with a lot of entities who, through proactive examination, are identifying problems and concerns. And that includes with HHS funding as well as some of the other funders that Toby has referenced. So I think my job here today is to just try to give a few tips and pointers on what we have found to be constructive in thinking about both how to respond, but maybe how to be proactive. And I think you've already heard this notion that what makes this arena especially important is how it does stress core values related to open science, the value of foreign talent, collaboration, and these are really important values. And at least our experience is that while yes, there's a challenge among a lot of entities with regard to what the applicable rules are, and the applicable rules are, depending upon the funding agency, changing or evolving, these basic values and philosophy and commitment of academic institutions are critical to emphasize as you work through understanding this new landscape. So when we think about visitors, collaborations, and collaborators and foreign activities, the sort of fundamental questions we ask is, are our processes sufficient? Do we both understand what the current state of play of the rules are, and are we able to ensure that we're able to satisfy those rules? What I have put into the slides are areas where one might look and one might find examples of concerns or problems. And it's important to recognize that the portfolio of specific problems that Dr. Lauer described and Mr. Smith referenced certainly happen. It is also true that there are many examples of perfectly reasonable, appropriate collaborations and foreign engagement that we want to see happen. And so you just, in our experience, you look at your current activities and you try to test and probe the understanding of your faculty. and frankly, maybe some of your compliance teams and the folks who are giving direction. So we talk about horizon scanning. I've emphasized values, and I think that communication is really the key to a lot of this, in part because it is somewhat of a moving target or a moving space, and in part because it is so fundamental to how universities, schools of public health do what they do and contribute to society. That said, to the extent that there are specific concerns or you have leadership that's concerned about where you might have some risks, we've seen people do sampling and auditing, both with regard to significant financial interest disclosure as well as with regard to their applications and progress reporting. These are valuable tools, just like they are in any other field of or arena of compliance. Setting up ways to make sure you can hear from your faculty what their concerns are, and you can ensure that your faculty understand both your own policies and the applicable reporting duties is sort of the key. Responding to inquiries. So we've already talked about what examples of real problems are. What we have found is, as you know, there are a number of lanes through which an inquiry might come. It may come from NIH and Dr. Lauer's office. It can come from the Office of Inspector General. It can come from the Department of Justice in the form of a subpoena. And we've seen all of that. And collaboration, communication, engaging, for example, the Bureau is a really important opportunity. And while we are seeing questions, queries, and reasons to look into the activities of faculty coming from many quarters, we are also seeing a real openness to try to solve problems and recognize the values in play and support that. Very nitty gritty, we have had a lot of back and forth, a lot of effort to sort of unpeel an onion, understand what's happening with any individual scientific laboratory or investigator, and proceed to address the specific concerns that the agency or agencies are raising. The risks, of course, are federal sanctions, loss of funds, et cetera, but they're also reputational. And my own sense is that we're not done yet in what this may look like a year or 2 or 3 years from now. The nuts and bolts of an investigation, I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on that right now. To some degree, it's sort of, it's not unique to this area, but we have found all the things described in the slides to be important. I make the point about how this dovetails with anti-discrimination law, and it's important. It's just an important thing to keep in mind. That too speaks to reputational risk if something goes south. And generally speaking, when you're responding to a government inquiry, you're certainly protected. And furthermore, in this arena where we do have so much evidence of concern about specific examples of wrongdoing, generally speaking, you should be well protected, but it's important to be sensitive to those risks. What we found is that when we look at, for example, financial disclosures, that's one of the 3 areas Mike focused on. Consulting is a conundrum. People have different definitions of what it means, of how to apply it. And so just for awareness, what is really consulting, what is maybe employment disguised as consulting, or vice versa. Be sensitive to travel. Understand, well, gee whiz, we're going to pull a bunch of students over. That's a terrific thing. We love to do that. But it may or may not represent, for example, an other support requirement that doesn't get seen as that and therefore doesn't get reported. And as discussed, time and effort issues. To the extent that you are undertaking an investigation, this is hard. It's hard because there's so many core values in play. It's hard because people often don't recognize what they're doing is or can be seen as wrong. And of course, it's hard because sometimes it is kind of obvious that it's wrong and it has been withheld or hidden. As I said, we have found folks who just really didn't understand some things and maybe made poor choices in their disclosures. It's not unique to any institution. It's not unique to any individual, but it has to be understood and sort of we have to move forward because it makes the case for folks who, as Toby references, who don't necessarily understand the safeguards that are already in place or don't understand all the work universities and schools such as yours have done to both enable global collaboration and protect the interests of the taxpayers. We have to do a better job, I think, of making sure the policymakers understand what's already in place. Corrective actions and communication. Again, communication is important, and at the end of the day, when you find a problem or the government asks you about a problem, corrective action is going to go a long way towards mitigating risk and lowering the temperature. And sometimes it's really obvious stuff like more training or clarifying policies, making people available. This corrective action pathway, again, is not really unique to this particular area of compliance questions. It's just how do we think about it? And it is perhaps novel and challenged by virtue of the fact that there is, to a degree, a fair amount of confusion, at least that we have seen in the field. So that is the end, and hopefully we have enough time for questions.
All right, thank you, Valerie, so much for sharing your wisdom and particularly your commentary on values and communication. So just to remind everybody in these last couple of minutes, you can submit questions using the question box, which should be on the lower right-hand side of your screen. While we get some of those, Dr. Lauer, could you please tell us how you would recommend reporting international collaborations on NIH grants? Should all collaborators and potential co-authors be listed on the biosketch and on the foreign component? How do we do this?
Well, we don't have much time, but very briefly, there's a question on all applications in which we ask whether or not the research is going to involve foreign collaborations. And if the answer to that is yes, you check yes, and then there's a follow-up question. If a substantial amount of the work is going to be done outside of the United States, we consider that to be a foreign component. There's a standard procedure by which that needs to be reported and approved. And I would just say, when in doubt, disclose, and also have a very low threshold to contact NIH staff for questions.
Okay, thank you. Could you also comment on foreign graduate students and postdocs who can't receive NRSA training grants, and they're often funded off of other projects but not listed as key personnel? How should we vet those critical team members?
That's not something that we've really dealt with. Most of our focus has been on, most if not nearly all of our focus has been on senior investigators. That is something that OSTP is dealing with, the NSTC Security Committee that I believe Toby referred to, and I anticipate that there will be some guidance that will come out on that.
Okay, and this is a question really for any of you. Many foreign universities are considered government-owned or government-controlled enterprises. So how are we to assess whether a university collaboration is truly independent of a national government?
I'll defer to my colleagues.
I think I'm not so sure that you can, that the issue of a government affiliation, because if you look at our own universities, they're government affiliated too. It's the nature of the collaboration. And one word we didn't mention was reciprocity. But is there, what's the nature of the relationship and what is happening? I think we have to start warning faculty that they should not be participating particularly in programs at China where it's like, we'll give you money and you give us information, or come, even being careful, a little bit more strategic about when talks are given in China or things like that. It doesn't mean there aren't collaborations, even with China, that aren't going to be really important. It's just we have to heighten the awareness of particular faculty, I think, as it relates to some of the things we're seeing. I think Dr. Lauer's been doing a great job in terms of giving these examples out, which people look at them and they go, yeah, this is a real problem. And so I think we just need to continue to work our administrators are getting there, but faculty are the next frontier, I think, in terms of trying to educate. I'd say one other thing about students, we didn't talk much about students, but I also think that we need, in responsible conduct of research training modules, some training on ethics. A lot of the things we're seeing aren't necessarily illegal, but they're certainly unethical. They're things that you should get kicked out of the lab if you do. But I'm not sure all Chinese students or students from other foreign countries and their own students are necessarily always taught about what lines they can't cross. The fact you don't share data from your PI's or your advisor's work without them knowing with other people. You don't take things from the lab without them knowing it upon getting your PhD. So those are some rules we need to do a better job in terms of providing training on. I think there's some focus on that now.
Thank you. So we've come to the end of our scheduled time together, and we're really grateful for the participation of Dr. Lauer, Mr. Smith, Ms. Bonham on today's webinar. I really appreciate your, even though the examples have been in China, the openness and the support for international collaborations and those values. So I appreciate all of you for mentioning that. And I will now turn this back to Tony.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Gordon Larson, and thanks to our speakers. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be made available on the ASPPH website in the archived webinar section soon. All registrants for the webinar will receive an email shortly with additional details. Please be sure to contact us if you think of any questions that weren't addressed today. Those can be sent to advocacy@asppph.org. And if you would like to address a question to one of the speakers, you can send it to that same address and I'd be happy to transmit it. Our next webinar is on Wednesday, October 16th at 11 a.m. and is titled 400 Years of Inequality, a Public Health Perspective to Eliminate Racial Disparities. Again, that's on Wednesday at 11 a.m. Additional information on this special webinar is available on the ASPPH website, although the webinar is free, registration is required. So we've come to the end of the webinar, and I'd like to thank you for your participation, and the webinar is now adjourned.